Good evening. Welcome to our study in Romans. Tonight we're in chapter 5. We're going to be looking at verses 12 through 14. Admittedly, these are a little bit deeper, not because what's said there is so complex, but because a lot of false teaching has been applied to John 5:12 and also John 3:23. So, let's go ahead and start with verse 12 and we'll do some digging. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men, because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. All right. The first problem that occurs, or the big problem that occurs, relates to what it says in verse 12 when it says, because all sinned. This is very similar to what we find in Romans chapter 3. We'll jump back to 21 and read 21 through 23. And it says there, but now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifest, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ, for all those who believe, for there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Okay. It's important that we take those words and don't change them. The word, actually not words, the word that gets changed is sinned. And while people may not say it differently, a lot of times the way it gets treated is like, because all sin. And I don't mean commit the act, I mean have sin. Sort of like all have a heart. Because all have a heart beating inside of them, yeah, you have a heart beating inside of you or you're dead. You've got to have it. You got to have it from the beginning all the way through till you're done. Might not be in a pig's heart, but that's a different story. That's different from sinned. Active did something. And verse 23 is the one that gets quoted when they're going to abuse it. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And for the people that abuse it, the denominations that do, they define people as point of conception forward. So, all have sinned means a fetus has sinned, and without the blood of Christ through baptism, it goes to hell. Or it goes to purgatory because they decided it was a little bit too nasty to say that a fetus was going to go to hell, so now fetuses get to go to purgatory. Except supposedly you couldn't get out of purgatory until they decide, oh, you can't do it that way either. So we got a special out for those that ended up there and really didn't belong there because their warped view said so. Sorry if you don't know which denominations I'm referring to, but suffice to say, yes, that's a cornerstone belief in some denominations that all have sin like having a heart. That's not the word that's used. All sinned. First off, when we're talking about Romans chapter 5, we're talking about Adam to Moses. All sinned. Okay. Past accomplished we get, because Adam and Moses aren't around still. So if they were going to do any sinning, it's already been done. That's why it's past tense sinned. But there's another thing that we need to remember, and I'm going to pull in John on this one as well. Think about what Romans 1 told us about what sin was. It was choosing to ignore and act against the truth and the knowledge God had shown through what he had created. John 3:18. He who believes in him is not judged. He who does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. I think that would probably be better translated, he who believes not. Not meaning ignorance, but rejection of truth. And that's what Romans 1 said, rejection of God's truth. John, I believe, is saying the same thing. He who believes not, he who rejects the Son of God is already judged. Notice also the word believe there. It takes belief to not be judged. It takes disbelief, not meaning ignorance, not meaning I can't comprehend it, but rejection to be judged. Let's go back to verse 12. All sinned. That implies did something against what they knew to be God's will. Did something that was against God's truth. Keep that in mind, and let's look at Isaiah 7:14 through 16. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. Before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good. That tells us there is a time when a child lacks the understanding of good and evil. You might think, well, of course, duh, we get that. No, not everybody gets that. From the standpoint of, if you don't understand good and evil, if you don't have knowledge, if you can't believe because you don't have a mind developed enough to be able to have a belief, you can't believe not. You can't sin insofar as reject God when you don't have enough understanding to know that there's a choice to be made. That's what it's saying in Isaiah 7:14 through 16. There's a time when a child, not a fetus even, a child doesn't have the capability to choose. And that's the other important part. Doesn't have the capability to choose. Now let's go back to Romans 5:12. All sinned. We're talking about those who lived from Adam to Moses, but we're also talking about those who could choose. Those who could choose all sinned. Those who could not choose could not sin. They could do things that were wrong. It's like reaching out and grabbing a gun, pulling the trigger because it's a hair trigger, and oh, I'm 2 years old. 2-year-old doesn't understand what they're doing when they accidentally pull the trigger on a loaded gun and kill somebody. Yes, the person who left out the loaded gun's insane. I agree on that point, but that's not the point of what I'm trying to say here. What I'm trying to say is the 2-year-old doesn't have an understanding of pulling a trigger and killing somebody. The 2-year-old can't do wrong of volition. They can do it of commission. They committed the act of murder. As far as what was the physical act accomplished? Pulled trigger, somebody dies. Okay. Understanding? Not a bit of it. They can't sin insofar as it being attributed to them. Where there is no law, sin is not imputed. Not meaning God didn't have a law. We know from the beginning there was. From the beginning, God gave witness through what he created. That's in Romans chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. No man has excuse. But it also tells us being understood through the things that were made. Being understood. That doesn't include young children, unborn infants. It's talking about those who have the ability to understand. Like Isaiah points out, there is a point when they don't understand, and after it, obviously they fall into judgment. When they understand is when they can sin. The ones who all sinned were the ones who could understand. It's also important to notice then in verse 14, when it says, "Nevertheless, sin reigned from Adam to Moses." There is no written law from Adam to Moses, and that's the reason why Moses was tossed in there. It's because at the time of Moses, God tells them the 10 Commandments, and then God gives them directly on tablets the 10 Commandments. Prior to that time, there wasn't a written law in the world, but there was still God's understood law through the things He'd created. You may not realize what a lie is until the first time you've been told one and realize you've been lied to. All of a sudden, you gain an understanding when you've been wronged of the wrongness of lying. If you lived in a world where nobody ever told a lie, you'd have no understanding of the wrongness of lying. Somebody might tell you about it, but if it wasn't part of the culture and it just never happened, you could have the head knowledge without really having the understanding of it. These people, Adam to Moses, had the understanding of it because they'd experienced it. The church in Rome, the people who grew up outside of Judaism, who came to accept Christ, had that kind of understanding of sin. They understood that in what was created, there were obvious truths. Truths that sometimes people rejected because they didn't want the truth. They wanted what they wanted. Rejecting truth, rejecting God, sin, reigned from Adam to Moses. But it also said, sin is not imputed when there is no law. There's no law with a 2-year-old. There's no law with a fetus. There's no law when the child doesn't have enough understanding to be able to make that kind of decision. That's what he's telling them. Now, yeah, I've covered a lot of ground here, and I've covered a lot of different scriptures. And the reason why it has to get so broad is because this passage in Romans 3:23 get abused when they say, oh, the word all means all humans from conception forward. No, it doesn't. It doesn't because Romans 1 says it doesn't. Understood. New. That means people of an age that have understanding and know. And yes, when it says all of them sinned, yeah, we're all sinners. Because we've made the choice at some point, many points, to do wrong. Because we've made that choice, we need what it talks about at the end of 14. Adam is the one through whom the transgression began. There's another of the type who was to come, Christ, who's the one by which our salvation began. Have a good week.